Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the CEO and co-founder with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We have worked with life science companies and pharmaceutical companies for the last 14 years across the globe to help them with everything from advisory programs like advisory boards virtually to peer influence programs like ambassador programs and journal clubs, to even virtual education. But more importantly at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts from a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, the digital provocateurs, and the healthcare thought leaders, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm super excited about having one of these healthcare thought leaders at the table with me today. This is actually Dr. Waqaas Al-Siddiq. He's actually the founder and CEO of a company called Biotricity. This is actually a company that's building a comprehensive suite of remote cardiac monitoring products, software, as well as services. Most cardiac remote monitors are passive. They don't really record the ECG or other cardiac data in real time and lack cross-compatibility with other platforms and devices. Conversely, Biotricity's core product, it's called BioFlux, is a turnkey solution offering the kind of advanced continuous monitoring that allows cardiologists to see warning signs much earlier, and so that they can actually act proactively. This also integrates really seamlessly into existing systems, which is really essential for physicians today. Now, the company also recently launched a product called BioHeart. It's a similar device, but for the consumer market. And it's also the most precise cardiac monitor available without a prescription, as well as a product called Biotress. It's a groundbreaking new Holter monitor that's designed for long-term wear. So welcome, Waqaas. Very nice to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Beautiful. So taking a look at your background, it's really interesting to see that your background is in computer engineering. You've also, had design positions in companies like IBM as well as Intel. And here you find yourself in healthcare. I was wondering if you could describe to the audience, what was your career trajectory and how did you ever end up starting a company like Biotricity?
No, excellent question. So it's kind of as most founder stories and entrepreneurial stories, kind of like a twisted road, but there's always that catalyst that started it. And so, as an engineer, I did a lot of research. My focus was actually in monitoring wireless networks, sensor networks. So I got interested in this idea of remote monitoring environments using sensors, when I was doing my graduate training. And so that kind of precipitated this idea of, what are applications of that? And one of the applications, of course, is health and monitoring ourselves. And I felt that the future of monitoring and the future of technology in healthcare was all going to be in this environment of sensors and sensor monitoring. And so that, it was something that I kind of stepped away from, did the big engineering thing, or did some investment banking, got the entrepreneurial bug, went into cloud computing, but ultimately that was kind of always there. And then finally I saw this path and this huge push towards fitness and lifestyle became a mainstream concept. And then that kind of, led me back to thinking about what my interest was. And I said, this is time for me to kind of pursue my own passion. And that's what I did.
Well, it sounds fascinating. And obviously you're actually now being traded, I guess, on the public market, which is really kudos to you. So congratulations for that. We know that first of all, it's an astounding name. I love it. Biotricity. I mean, how could you not remember it? But again, with your focus on the cardiac, tell us a little bit about, you were saying that you're doing a lot of work in sensors, but why did you specifically decide that cardiac and cardiac health was where you wanted to work in?
No, so another great question. So the reason we looked at cardiac was, that was a very methodical approach, actually. So the number one killer in the world is cardiac issues, right? And it's because it's a complex issues, and we always saw that all roads kind of lead to cardiac, right? If you have these other conditions, you generally have a higher risk for cardiac issues. And then when you look at cardiac issue in and of itself, it's intermittent. And oftentimes it's asymptomatic. Issues happen at nighttime. So all of these little, data points for us, when we looked at it, we said, wow, you really need something that's connected, smart, and long-term. And my whole focus was, when we're looking at disease modalities and looking at markets and looking at where is the biggest problem, we were trying to find something that, had those characteristics that really required the necessity for long-term data for analyzing in real time directly relates to, better outcomes and, saving an individual's life. And so that's where cardiac really became a focus. And it's a problem that's not just, in the United States or in one country. It's pretty much responsible for 1 in 3 deaths in every country in the world.
So we know that the cardiac and cardiac conditions is the #1 killer. It's one of the most profound and probably expensive conditions that healthcare has to deal with today globally. So I was wondering if you could actually say, I mean, if you're an individual that, let's just say, for example, you have an arrhythmia, or there's, you've had a congestive heart failure in the past and now need to be monitored. Before the advent of Biotricity, what was the pathway? What was the customer journey, or what was the patient journey like before you ever entered into the scene? So what was literally the problem statement?
Yeah, no. So, what the problem was with patients beforehand, before we essentially came onto the scene, was you've got a high risk patient, right? They've got high comorbidities, bad data, high risk of having a stroke, heart attack, AFib. They're coming in, they're complaining of a palpitation or an issue. And the doctor has 2 tools available to them, truly, right? They have a Holter monitor, which they know if they send the patient out for long term, there's a high risk that the patient's going to have an event and they're going to end up in the ER, maybe even pass on. Or check them into the hospital and monitor them bedside, right? And so the idea of sending them, home on a monitor, which is passively recording, is creating patient risk, versus putting them onto the bedside is creating an expense. Doctors would not always make the right decision, of course, right? Like there are many patients that look better than their blood work, makes it look like they're in better shape than they actually are. And so some patients would end up in the hospital, and other patients end up on a monitor, go home, they have a massive event, stroke, heart attack, maybe they go into heart failure and they never wake up. So that was the essential problem, right? So how do we take medium to high risk patients and enable them to go home and monitor them over a long period of time while creating this safety net of active monitoring?
So that leads us into one of your first and most important products, which is BioFlux. I understand that it's a mobile cardiac telemetry device. Maybe you can explain a little bit about how this was, how you devised this, how does it work, and what does it do?
For sure. So BioFlux is a smart monitor, right? So let's talk about that, regional problem statement concept, right? So when you're on bedside, you're on a monitor. It's a smart monitor essentially, and it beeps, right? It sends a beep to the nurse saying, hey, something's going on, and the nurse rushes in and figures what's going on. So it's essentially actively analyzing your data and determining if you go out of range. The Holter product is something that is collecting your data. You bring it back to the clinic, you download the data, you send it off for analysis, and 2 weeks later you get a report, and then you can do what you're doing. So what the BioFlux does is it's got a built-in cellular network. So it's got its own chip, takes a SIM card. So it's a cellular device, first and foremost. So it can transmit data. Second, it collects your ECG, so that's its sensor. And then it analyzes that data. So it's recording and analyzing in real time. And what it's actually looking for is it's looking for anomalies. And whenever it detects an anomaly, it has 2 essential thresholds, right? Something that is of concern, but not emergency, and then something that is of an emergency concern. And then you also have a patient-generated symptom base. So patient feels something, they touch a button. So what that does is when the device detects an anomaly that it considers something that you should pay attention, it automatically transmits it to a call center. You have nurses and CCT certified technicians that can look at that data, determine if it is an emergency or not, and deal with the response. Or most cases, in that case, it's not an emergency. It's just something that the doctor needs to pay attention to. So they'll send the data and the physician can see it the next day. In the emergency situation, it'll follow emergency protocol, right? Doctor may say, call me, or call the ER, send the data there, get the patient into the hospital. And so the call center will essentially deal with all of that process. And if the patient pushes an event, it will immediately trigger the device to transmit that piece of data saying that patient's having a symptom, and then let's analyze that. So even if it doesn't meet the threshold of emergency or something of concern, if it's patient driven, it will automatically transmit the data for review. And so what that does is, you think about the original use cases. If a patient's pushing a button on a Holter, you're waiting, it's marking the recording, right? So you have to wait until the data is downloaded, then you analyze, then you see where the marking is, versus a patient being able to push a button and know that someone's going to look at that event to determine if it is an emergency, what we need to do. And so that's the big difference in terms of, what it was in the industry and then how the BioFlex actually works, because it is very much a smart monitor. It's actively analyzing your data. And when one of its algorithms are tripped, it will then go and transmit it.
So what about machine learning embedded? Is this something that is current or something in the future model, i.e. creating the device as an N=1, being able to assess versus your baseline and being able to say might be an anomaly versus, the standard algorithm, but is it for you specifically? Is that something in the future model?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're playing around with is how do we, so once you have a patient that has been diagnosed with the condition, if they've been on the BioFlex, we're looking at, okay, can we build a profile? Do we know how this patient reacts to certain scenarios differently than another person with the same condition? And how can we actually get into personalized medicine? The other thing that we are doing is saying that, okay, as we collect all of this data and understand different people, can we get into predictive monitoring where we say, okay, we've seen this before, we know what's going to happen. Can we send off the alert even earlier? And that's really machine learning. So, when we talk about, edge AI or edge processing, like we're talking about a small device, on device analysis. It's very algorithmic based, right? Then when you go into the cloud and we forward all that data into the cloud, because it's a cellular connected device, we can create edge AI. And then the end point of that is, okay, the big data play, which is machine learning and saying, okay, great, I've got all of this data across so many different patients. Let's say we're saying AFib, right? Out of all of these different demographics of AFib, let me see if there's a commonality on how AFib presents. And can I predict it a week in advance, 3 days in advance, 4 days in advance?
Beautiful thing, and something that we are all looking forward to in the debacle of a healthcare system that we're all currently in. So that sounds extremely exciting. So as we think about population health management, et cetera, is there a play at the governmental level for data lakes of this type, for the assertion of where certain types of conditions might be more prevalent, predominant, for perhaps their location or the creation of a new cardiac rehabilitation center in specific jurisdictions? Is that something that's a dream, or is that even a possibility?
So I think it's a multi-layer problem, right? So first of all, you've got too many patients, not enough cardiologists. There's certainly concentration of certain types of individuals in certain areas, and I think that certain areas are more proactive, and part of that is like federal focus, CMS focus, state level focus, insurance focus. I do see that insurance is paying more attention to these types of chronic conditions, and ultimately this is CMS driving it. So I do see a path to that. To your point, I think it's going to be focused on where you see a high degree of concentration in cardiac issues, right? So part of that is going to be like, okay, well, where are the aging demographics? Where are the people that have, maybe, the fried chicken diet, right? Those kinds of things. So I certainly think that there are going to be first movers. But I think that overall in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe earlier, what I will say the positive is that CMS is actively saying that, look, we need to engage, and we need to engage earlier. Because that's going to be long-term more beneficial for the patient and cheaper for the system. And that's enforcing everybody to pay attention to it.
So a really interesting device, Waqaas, and I'm just curious if you are looking at this device as being a diagnostic, or is it going to be at some point deemed as a medical software, as a medical device, or where is its play in its positioning?
So BioFlux is a diagnostic device, right? So we've been trying to take that technology and democratize it, right? So BioFlux for sure is the diagnostic device, is prescription based. And I don't think that's going to change because you need to be able to make a diagnosis out of it. And at the end of the day, if you want to cut somebody open, at some point you have to have a level of gravitas on how that data and that workflow is working and it's aligned with. Right now, maybe FDA changes it and opens things up. I don't foresee that happening. But we've taken that technology, we made it available in BioHeart in a simplified way. So it's got the same level of quality, but you don't get to see the depth of data as you would in the BioFlux. So it's a simplified version, but it's designed to say, okay, well, if you are, pre-diagnosis, right, at risk, is there a product that's available that you can use with in conjunction with your GP or in conjunction with research and analyzing if you're a proactive person to help manage your condition, and it gives you a feedback loop so that you can better manage it, right? And the data that you're collecting is clinical grade and quality, but not giving you the depth of analysis that's going to necessarily scare you. Like, it's giving you enough information that you can act upon it, but not so much that you're getting confused by it, right? Because not most people can't read their ECG and understand what it really means, right? They need a simplified explanation for it. So we're really looking at how to navigate that water. And I think that that is something that many companies are trying to do. And I think that's the future of healthcare, right? Try to bring more clinical grade sensors into this idea of engagement, personal health, and personal health consumption, but doing so in a way that doesn't confuse an individual and making sure it's meaningful.
Yeah, beautiful. As a diagnostic, there's probably a lot of people who are wanting to jump on the bandwagon of how, of whatever their remedies are, or, I'm thinking about medical device companies, pharmaceutical companies. How is Biotricity looking at partnering, working with these folks, either as part of their intervention or potentially as part of clinical trials?
So what we are doing from a partnership perspective is, so certainly our whole focus is how can we make this stuff more available and active. So we're working a lot with hospitals and independents. Now what we're trying to do is, okay, where else are these patients coming in? Can we catch them earlier? So, can we make partnerships with the people who are innovating in the urgent care or the GP world, right? You've seen some of these groups that have come out, like One Medical, who are creating clinics around the country, right? Which are really for coming in and servicing the patient, for general medicine purposes. So can we capture these patients there? And can we help get a profile of these patients way, way earlier in the process? Because right now you're correct, right? We're very late in the process, right? You're already at the cardiologist, right? So we're trying to say, okay, how can we go more downstream? So part of that is going to be absolutely through partnerships. We also know that clinical trials, one of the biggest risk factors for clinical trials are impact on the heart, right? So how do we work? And there's a lot of people that are innovating. So how do we work, and who are the right partners to work with on the clinical trial side that are doing these distributed clinical trials, right? And digitally enabled clinical trials, and still tracking, medical quality data to see, okay, is this something that can create an issue? And if so, they can also make it safer for the patient or the individual during the clinical trial process. So certainly an area that we are investigating, working with, and we're trying to figure out, who are the right partners. And we're trying to pick out the guys who are innovating, right? Because you can go GP by GP, but somebody who's building a clinic network is a much better partner. You can go clinical trial by clinical trial versus a platform that is supporting clinical trial that is integrated with technology.
Totally makes sense. I love it. Love the idea. Now, we talked a lot about BioFlux. I know you've got some other products that you've just released as well. One of them called Biotress. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what this looks like and really how you're jumping on the bandwagon around remote patient monitoring.
Yeah, for sure. So, Biotress that we created, really, it was in response to our customers, right? So we were really focused on and believe that the future is really about smart diagnostics, right? And, one of the things that we realized very quickly is that there's this huge market for that Holter space, the low risk screening, right? Someone who's complaining of something, their numbers are good, they're healthy, their BMI is excellent. Lower likelihood of them having a cardiac issue, but because they complain, they want to put on a Holter monitor and collect that information. And in that case, what we realized is that these lower to medium risk patients, it's a massive market, but the problem is that they're not connected devices. I mean, 2 weeks. So if you have a heart issue, someone gives you a 10-day monitor, and then you got to wait another 10 to 14 days after that. Like, you feel you have an issue. You went to a doctor. He says, okay, let me put you on a heart monitor, and you're waiting 21 days. It's just not, in 2022, like, we just didn't think that that was okay. And so the BioTray is a connected Holter monitor. And so what we did here is we took out the cellular technology. We basically made the device as cheap as possible. But we really focused on how do we get data back to the patient, and how do we get the diagnostic as quickly as possible. So it's still a connected Holter, which means that if you use your app and download the application, it'll actually upload the data, and you'll get your data back, and you'll have your report back within a couple days. So going from 2 weeks down to a couple days is a huge peace of mind for an individual. Or if you don't connect it, the moment it comes back to the clinic, it'll sync up and push all the data, and then you'll have have your summary within 3 to 4 days. So that's really a product that we created in response to this specific problem of leaving patients that were lower risk in the dark for 2 weeks post getting a diagnostic done.
And then tell us a little bit about BioHeart and this whole idea. I mean, we've been talking about continuous heart monitoring, but why is this different from BioFlux or BioTray?
Yeah, so BioHeart is a total consumer product, right? It goes back to what you were saying about earlier, like, how do we get people to engage? How do we get them earlier? So, there's the worried well, there's the people at risk, there's, way earlier in the process, people with family history. And so how do we collect data? And so BioHeart was really, it's funny because I would almost say that Biotricity was founded to build BioHeart, not really BioFlux. Because when we first came, and when we first started this interview and this chat, was that there's this intermittent issue, there's this asymptomatic issues. There are so many diagnosed patients and people at risk, but diabetics have a glucometer. People with hypertension have a blood pressure cuff. What do cardiac patients have? They have a 30-second ECG that they can collect off of an Apple Watch or a small little device that connects to their phone. But 30 seconds on an issue that's intermittent, asymptomatic, that happens while you're sleeping, it's impossible, right? Well, maybe not impossible, but it's very, very difficult. And so we took all that technology and everything that we learned from the BioFlux, and we created this personal heart monitor, which essentially is like, wear it and forget it. It will record months, years. I mean, as much data as you really want. You'll drown in data. The point is not to drown you in data, but when you have that issue, when you think you have that issue, when you're sleeping, it's got thresholds that you can set as an individual, and that can tell you that, oh, you know what, I want to go show this to my GP, or I want to go talk to my doctor and say, hey, I set this threshold. This was strange to me, and the device recorded it because it's always recording. So what it does is we took a lot of the technology that we learned with BioFlux, simplified it for sure, took away all of the super clinical confusing stuff, but we did say that, okay, let's set thresholds so that individuals can mark that data for whenever they want to review, and then they can take that to the physician, and the physician is not going to be like, okay, great, this is your step count, I don't know what this means to your heart, right? It's important and from a data perspective and clinically relevant that the doctor can say, okay, I need to put you on a diagnostic monitor, I need to put you on a BioFlux because now I see that you may actually have an issue. And so that's what the BioHeart is for, and to support disease management. The people who are diagnosed, like, you've been diagnosed on the BioFlux, you're put on a medication, what do you do now?
Absolutely. I really like the way you've devised and developed these devices. So you've moved earlier on. So you're trying to capture from early onset right to the very end. So that's actually a great profile of product. I was also just curious, especially for the worried well, and some of the people in the earlier stages who are collecting this information on their phone, on the app that you've created. How do you deal with interoperability with electronic health records, with physicians who might not even know about this particular app or this device? And how are they interplaying this with the myriad, like you said, this confluence of data floating from all over the place, including the smartphone and the smartwatch and fitness trackers and all this other stuff? How do you interoperate this? And secondly, how do you differentiate it from the myriad of other data noise that's out there?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, differentiation is always, I mean, it's a struggle, right? We're always trying to, because there is a lot of noise and there is a lot of discussion, and we're always trying to focus on this clinical piece of it. One of the ways that we're combating it is with the BioHeart is really working with clinicians and getting them to, educate and help us, because, our demographics, the patients that are on the BioFlux is a perfect customer for the BioHeart, right? For personal use. In terms of interoperability and working, we're doing, there's the Fire, there's the traditional, EMR bidirectional integration so that we can do that. That's at least to push data into the EMR and integrate. And we really work with hospital systems and providers and their EMR vendors to get all of that sorted out so they don't have to deal with that struggle. On the personal side, we've built our apps and our technology so that they can integrate like data from Fitbit or your Apple Watch or your Google phone and the Apple Health, and so that we can aggregate that information in one place and centralize it. So there is that interoperability. And so we've supported that because we know that people use that. And, our hope is that we can show the differentiation of our product when we put that information alongside our information, right? And outside of that, education and, differentiation and ensuring that the market and individuals understand, that's a constant struggle. And I think that's, across every industry. And we know in healthcare how difficult it is for patient compliance and all of that. So I don't think that's a new problem. I think it's an ongoing thing. And, discussions like this help, and we try to learn from our users and try to use their information and how they understand the product and use that in our marketing and in terms of how we communicate outward.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. And I really love the fact that you brought this whole thing around adherence and patient compliance. At the end of the day, no matter how simple you try to create like an external halter or whatever, it's still a thing. It's still a thing that people have to remember to put on, or they get irritated with it. Is there a longer term play, Waqaas, on something that's, because again, you're an expert in sensors, looking at something that just gets embedded? How far are we from something like that where literally the person won't even notice it's on them for that continuous monitoring of data?
So, I mean, there's a lot of discussion around tattoos. So we follow this, right? Like, so the question is implantable versus non-implantable, right? So I think that, within the next 5 years, we will start seeing technology that is going to be more, light implant or close to us, tattooed. There are certain issues that are very interesting, that are technically complicated. And then we've got this whole issue about battery and battery charging, and how to, as battery technology improves, I think it's going to make a lot of other form factors more possible, right? Because you can collect for data for a longer term information. Like, I'll give you our BioHeart as an example, right? BioHeart is a strap, right? And once you get used to it, you sort of forget you're wearing it. I'm actually wearing mine right now. So, and you get kind of used to it. The problem is that people, and this becomes an interesting thing, because people are always like, well, why does it have to be a strap? Why can't you do it as a wrist or something like that? Well, the problem is, to get an electrical signal across your heart, you have to go across your heart. So in order to go across your heart, you have to be on both sides of the human body, right? And if you're on a wrist, you have to essentially complete the circuit, right? So you have to hold the watch, which is why when you're collecting ECG with an Apple Watch or something like that, you actually have to hold the watch for the whole period of time that you're recording. So in order to get something across your for the heart, you have to go across the chest, and in order for continuous monitoring, it has to be a wearable that goes across your chest. And so there are other categories of sensors, like if you wanted to collect brain information, right, you have to go around the brain. You can't collect it from one point. And so as battery technology gets better, you can make those things smaller, more wearable. People don't like sticky things, so how do you deal with that? So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting technology that comes out. I think tattoos are going to be a very interesting access point, because they stick to your skin, but they're not sticky. So, I think and there is a lot of work being done on tattoo-based sensors.
I'm also curious, Simone, we've heard a lot around the Google's DeepMind AlphaFold project and the myriad of really interesting proteins. And I think Meta did something recently as well. And just curious about your thoughts on the future of materials that we may not even know that could be used with sensors.
That's exactly right. So that's another thing that I think that, as we start creating these, and I think that a lot of the analysis protein-based using, we're talking about delivery now. I read a lot about precision medicine because of how drug delivery can be, hijacked on a virus, or using, biologics that can be grown and can create circuits. So there's a lot of interesting work being done on how can we use organic material to essentially create, chips, and to, going very, very technical in a hopefully more simplified way. Like, what is a processor, right? A processor is essentially lots and lots of switches. So on and off switches, right? Zeros and ones, right? That's essentially how a CPU works, except it's got, hundreds and millions of these on and off switches that are all coordinating to basically create our software, how Windows works and everything like that. So if we can figure that out at an atomic level or at an organic level, that means being able to collect information from the human body or sensors or communicate that is going to be way, way easier. So I really think that is going to be like the holy grail, and it's the future. And I think we're going to see this convergence of, these materials and then precision medicine that's going to essentially jump from the world of really drug delivery and pharmaceuticals to this world of remote monitoring and actually collecting information from an individual.
Yeah, it's a very exciting world, and we can probably go into a whole tangent with, I think, the singularity. I can't remember Ray who wrote the book. And I think he was talking a little bit about those biological transistors. So it's pretty cool. So kind of coming back to earth here and really just talking about the practicalities of who pays for this thing. Technically, Waqaas, what's the business model behind your company?
Yeah, so everything that we do, for the most part, is insurance-based, right? So we really understand what is CMS doing, how is reimbursement structured, and really focus on chronic conditions. Because if you have chronic conditions, it essentially means that you have a insurance that will pay to help you manage and do all of that. And so, in the context of, lifestyle management, in the context of diagnostics and our products, there is reimbursement that can be done. Now, the problem is at-risk patients, right? So unfortunately, we don't really, some private insurers are providing supplemental services and resources and things like that to individuals who are at risk, right? But by and large, insurance does not really do anything until you're diagnosed, which is unfortunate. So I think in that case, if somebody wants access to our technology, it's all private pay. But what we are trying to do is we're trying to really focus on the diagnosed group. And so in that case, it's insurance that's paying for it, right? If you come through the funnel and you're diagnosed, insurance pays for it. Once we and we're mastering that. And once we master that, we're constantly working with the insurance providers and to look outward and say, okay, well, you already know our product works and is effective and saves lives and helps diagnose people faster, helps them engage, drives patient compliance, adherence, all of that stuff when they're diagnosed. So don't you think we should try to capture them earlier? And so that's a constant struggle. That's a constant thing that we're working on. But what we do try and focus on is how do we build products that if you cross the threshold of being diagnosed, it aligns with insurance, so you don't have to pay for it.
In terms of those earlier intervention, which quite frankly just makes a lot of sense from a healthcare standpoint, getting away from sick care and reactive care to a wellness model. The question comes down to is, can you start investigating in, phase 4 real world evidence trials and perhaps getting into some risk sharing or outcomes-based agreements? Are these things that could be in the future of Biotricity?
Absolutely. And that's part of, going back to what you were talking about earlier is, how do we build those strategic partnerships of the right organizations that are looking at those things so that we can actually do these trials and we can show this information and show the process of, hey, look, we can catch this issue. And in this case, clinical trials are an interesting place because if you do it and you show it in the clinical trial environment, then you can actually leverage that information and say, okay, well, look, if it's working in the clinical trial, it should work in an at-risk environment. Let's go and do something. And you do these studies in conjunction with these partners or with insurance providers and show the outcomes.
Absolutely. I love the name of the company, Biotricity, because it really goes well with a big concept in life sciences right now around patient centricity and the focus of, it all goes around the patient. I know you mentioned that, either protocol development or prototypes, you're really always asking the end user. I was curious if you have like patient advisory boards, or actually how do you include the voice of the patient?
That's a great question. So on the patient side, what we do is we really engage with our patients. We do like surveys outside to them. We try to understand, like, even I think it was like a couple of weeks ago, we sent it out to all of our, BioHeart users to say, hey, would you be interested in being able to work with a cardiologist or a healthcare practitioner remotely to look at your data from your BioHeart, because it's all personal use, but do you want that insight? So the way we try to engage is we try to engage the users and when we come up with services or we come up with ideas, really push it out to them and get their insight. We don't have a patient advisory board. It's not a bad idea. But we deal with so many different types of patients and so many different demographics. So we're constantly trying to look at, services and concepts and ideas that we deliver, pushing it out, asking them for feedback, and then also looking at usability, what features are used, what features aren't used. And then when we see something that we think is really great, but the pickup isn't there, then we'll immediately proactively go out and say, okay, well, what don't you like about this? Because we thought it would have been great. And sometimes that answer is so counterintuitive to what we thought. And in many cases, it's resulted in the removal of features because it made things more complicated. And in some cases led to adding features.
It's really interesting in the SaaS world where people are just working on software or even devices. It's interesting to see that a differential in the healthcare space is that a lot of people feel that to truly perform is that you almost have to add a service to it. So I was just curious if you found that also occurred with Biotricity and if this was the advent of your BioCare program.
Yeah. So what we saw in terms of the service component, well, there is a service component with everything that we do, because even in the diagnostic piece, right, we're engaging with the patient during the process to make sure that they have a successful diagnosis or a successful experience with the diagnostic process, right? The BioCare really did come from the purpose of what Biotricity was trying to do, which was really to support the patient through the entire cardiac journey. And so there was that vision in the beginning when we said, okay, how do we track the patient through the entire cardiac journey and support them through each stage of that, right? And BioCare was really once you've been diagnosed, how do we help you manage that condition? And the verification of that, thesis was that patients that were on the BioFlux would show back up 6 months later, a year later. So we saw that when they were provided a medication to verify that their baseline and they are improving and that the outcomes are going in the right direction, they're back on the BioFlux for a secondary diagnosis or for a kind of like a check to make sure the baseline is the same 6 months later, a year later. And so that means that in between that time period, the patient essentially has no tool. And so BioCare was really created. First of all, it was certainly a part of the vision of the company, but the catalyst for moving faster on it and creating that entire program was that thesis was confirmed with the BioFlux, where we saw these patients coming back.
So it's interesting. It's almost like a type of community where you're like looking at the, longer than just the segment of the situation, but like you said, the customer experience over the long term, and potentially almost like a patient support program, if you will.
That's exactly right. And the good thing is that what we did with BioCare is we aligned it and designed it that it's something that is CMS reimbursable. So, and private insurance reimbursable. So it's like you can get into this program and you can engage in it if you want. And if you do, you have better outcomes, better compliance, better adherence. You know your physician and your care team has access to your information. You can be called in earlier. So all of that richness and all that benefit is there, and you don't have to pay for it.
It was interesting in the last couple of years since the pandemic, we've heard about things like the Great Resignation. We've had all the labor shortages. Employers have been looking for all kinds of bells and whistles to include in their perk packages. Is this something that Biotricity is, or the BioCare program with Halter monitors as a perk, paid for, helping with general better outcomes for their employees? What has that story been?
That has certainly been something that has popped up. We've had a few, corporate world, and I think that's an opportunity for us. We have not really focused on that. I mean, we've got a lot of things to focus on, and as a smaller organization, we're really focusing on the cardiac space. But it is exactly, it has become a topic, and we have, inbound interest. We have corporations that we meet that they're like, wow, we really want to provide this because we know they have the information on their employees. They know which ones are at risk. They know which ones are diagnosed. They know the expense that they're paying, right? And so they're saying, we really want to offer this. And so we have seen that opportunity. We certainly see it as something that employers would adopt, because again, if you take any employer, if 1 in 3 deaths are related to cardiac issues, you'd probably assume that 20 to 25% of your employee population is at risk or diagnosed with some sort of cardiac issue.
Super exciting. I have to say, when you've got all kinds of opportunity, it'd be really cool to speak to you in another year or two and see where the company is going and what has been innovated and what the uptake has been. So anybody who's interested in speaking with Waqaas, please take a look at the show notes for his contact details. If you're looking for partnership, discussion, seeing how you might be able to work together, please look for that. If you enjoyed this show, I would also encourage you to check out impetusdigital.com. These are the kinds of conversations that we have with payers, physicians, allied healthcare providers, and even patients, and things like advisory boards, working groups, steering committees, working together to help plan, protocols, what you're actually doing, marketing, medical, et cetera. These are the kinds of things that we do asynchronously and synchronously over a series of touch points over time. So we really appreciate if you can like and subscribe to our channel. We'd also appreciate if you can leave us some feedback on iTunes. We want to thank everybody for their time today. And thank you, Dr. Al-Siddiq, for a phenomenal conversation.